Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it some time for everybody to come on board. We still have people entering. Just going to give it another minute or two to see. Right, good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to our Northern Ireland economy outlook update. What I personally have been witnessing over the past few months is that our members are facing rising costs. That's in raw materials, freight, wages, and now national insurance. And it's all going to have an impact. There is a shortage of labour in certain sectors. And in other sectors, there's potential for redundancies as the furlough has just ended. Business owners, I have found, looks like they're just going to hit a brick wall. Something has to give. They cannot absorb these price hikes as well as the added administrative burden when exporting. Consumers, I think, will face rising prices. So the question is, what effect will that have in the Northern Ireland economy? Today, we have a regular contributor to our members, Conor Lambe, who is Chief Economist at Danske Bank. He joins us to talk through Danske's forecasts and his predictions for growth, as well as trends to watch over the coming months. Conor is responsible for the bank's economic analysis and forecasts, writing regular opinion articles for the Northern Irish media, and frequently speaking at local business events as well. Economic analysis is a useful tool for many businesses. It can help you understand what is driving the performance of the economy and whether current trends are likely to continue or to impact your business. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Conor, and I'm sure we'll all learn an awful lot from him this morning. So Conor, can you take it away, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Dawn, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you again, and I'm going to speak today, give a bit of an overview of the outlook for the Northern Ireland economy. I'm happy to take any questions, so please do put them in the chat box as we go through. My presentation will take about 20 minutes or so please put any questions in the chat, or alternatively, we'll have some time at the end, and I'll happily take any questions or comments then. So I will share my screen. And perhaps, Dawn, if you could just let me know when that appears on the screen for you.
I've got it here now. Conor, I can see it.
Perfect. I'll just put it in the presentation mode.
That's brilliant, Conor. Thank you.
So I'm going to begin this morning by just taking a look at what the latest economic data has shown us, both for the wider UK economy up to the second quarter of the year and for the Northern Ireland economy over the same time period. I'm then going to look at what we think are the 5 key trends that are expected to impact the economy over the last few months of 2021 and into 2022. I'll then set out our forecasts for the local economy, both at an overall macro level, but also at a sector level, looking at output projections and our forecast for employee jobs growth. And then I'll just conclude with some of the risks and uncertainties to look out for as we go over the next sort of 12 or 18 months. So if we begin with the UK economy, what I've plotted on this chart is UK GDP, consumer spending and business investment, and I've based it around the last quarter of 2019, so the period before the pandemic really hit. And if I focus on towards the end of the graph, 2021 Q2, what you can see is that we saw relatively strong growth across the overall economy, but both the consumer and business sides of the UK economy in that second quarter. And that was really as the coronavirus restrictions were eased following those in place at the beginning of the year. So UK GDP expanded by 5.5%, very strong rate of growth. Household spending grew very strongly. Business investment also expanded. Now you'll see from this line, if we look at how those different bits of the economy are performing relative to where they were prior to the pandemic. Overall economic output, so GDP still a bit below, just over 3% lower than it was at the end of 2019. Consumer spending is a little bit lower yet, and that's partly because government spending has played a big role in supporting the wider economy. So it's why it's a little bit further back than overall economic output. Business investment is further back still. This is probably not too much of a surprise. Business investment tends to take a little bit longer to recover from recessions. Following the global financial crisis, it took quite a long time for business investment in the UK to get back to where it was pre-crisis. And that's probably one of the reasons that, for example, in the budget earlier this year, the Chancellor announced the likes of the super deduction policy to try and encourage businesses to invest and to try and spur that bit of the economy to recover a bit more quickly than would normally be the case. But encouraging to see that in the second quarter, we saw that relatively broad-based expansion across the UK economy. Now, in Northern Ireland, as I've said on these webinars in the past, we collect our data a little bit differently to the rest of the UK. So we don't have that same consumer spending and business investment split. And we don't have that overall GDP number. But what we have here is our Northern Ireland Composite Economic Index. And this is a proxy measure for levels of economic activity in the local economy. And we also then have that split out by services production and construction activity. So like the UK, we saw relatively strong growth in the second quarter of the year in Northern Ireland, so just over 3%. Very much led by the services sector, which you'll see there grew at over 5%. And now that's really where the coronavirus restrictions were concentrated. Construction and manufacturing, which makes up most of the production sector, were able to remain open, for example, during the first quarter of the year, whereas there were some services businesses that were almost effectively closed. So the reopening of those led to a stronger bounce back. But again, encouraging that we saw all three main private sector parts of the local economy expanding in the second quarter of the year. So reasonably strong growth in Q2 as the coronavirus restrictions were eased. If we look forward to the rest of the year, there are 5 key trends which we expect to impact the performance of the economy, and I'll just speak to each of these in turn. So as we've mentioned, most of the coronavirus restrictions have now been lifted. Now there are still some rules in place, but certainly relative to the very beginning of this year, most of the rules and the regulations have been lifted. And that's probably going to continue to be the biggest driver of economic growth as we move forward, as it takes businesses some time to regain the levels of activity that they were at previously. And while those big bang growth rates that we saw in Q2 will probably moderate, I think most firms would expect to see a bit of a bounce in Q3 and Q4 relative to where we were previously, just as the outworking of that easing of restrictions plays through. I would also say that as we look forward, and in the forecast that I'm going to talk about, we don't assume that there are any further periods of lockdown. Now, I'll talk about some of the risks around the pandemic at the end, but the forecasts here aren't assuming that we see further periods of lockdown. So that easing of restrictions will hopefully give a bit of a boost to the economy going forward. In terms of the economic policy environment, we're seeing some changes there. So during the pandemic, both fiscal and monetary policy was very much targeted at supporting the economy through the adverse impacts that the pandemic brought. We saw large amounts of government spending and interest rates cut to an historic low. In terms of fiscal policy, we've started to see that support mechanism tailing off a little. So at the end of last month, we saw the end of the furlough scheme, one of the biggest policies supporting the economy. And there are some other changes as well around the tapering of the reduced VAT rate for hospitality businesses starting to come through as well. So fiscal policy is starting to weigh off somewhat. Of course, in Northern Ireland, there is still one fiscal lever that we're seeing at the minute is the High Street Voucher Scheme. So that will hopefully give a bit of a boost to local businesses in this fourth quarter of the year. But broadly speaking, fiscal policy is probably becoming a little bit less supportive than it was during the earlier parts of the pandemic. And that's just as the economy starts to recover. From an interest rate perspective, interest rates remain at that historic low of 0.1%, so that's still quite supportive of economic activity. A third key factor is supply chain disruption and higher inflation, and there's quite a bit in this, so I'll disentangle it a bit. And if we start with the inflation piece, what we saw over the summer, which is where the latest data takes us to, is a sharp rise in the rate of inflation in the UK economy. So I think the August figures took us up to, I think it was 3.2% of an inflation rate, so well above the Bank of England's 2% target. And there are a number of different factors that were contributing to that increase in the rate of price rises. The first is increases in global energy and fuel prices. So across oil, gas, and I'm sure many of us have seen this in the news, are much higher than they were a year ago. So we've seen the fuel and energy costs increasing. There's also base effects. So inflation is effectively calculated by looking at the rate of price increases now compared to a year ago. Obviously, throughout 2020, even during the summer as the economy was reopening, the pandemic had large global economic impacts. So prices were perhaps a bit more depressed in 2020 than would normally be the case, which does lead in some instances to quite strong percentage rates of increase. And then we've seen the supply chain disruption at play as well, across a number of different sectors and shortages. So some examples are the likes of the semiconductor shortage at the minute, which is impacting the production of electronics and even new cars, which as a secondary effect has actually put the price of used cars up quite a lot. That's one of the key trends coming through in the inflation figures. So we've seen quite a lot of supply chain disruption. And again, part of that is the outworkings of the pandemic. Given that it was a global phenomenon, there have different restrictions, different levels of activity in different economies around the world, especially with supply chains now so globally integrated, it has had an impact. And effectively just turning the global economy off and turning it on again has led to some challenges getting that up and running again. So that supply chain disruption is feeding into the higher inflation, but it's also acting as a bit of a barrier to output increases for businesses as well. If you're having difficulties getting the raw materials that you need to produce, whatever it is you're taking to market, then of course that's going to mean that the activity in your business is a bit slower. So that supply chain disruption is, yes, feeding into higher inflation, but it's also probably holding back the rate of economic output growth a bit as well. Now, our expectation is that supply chain disruption and the higher inflation will be temporary. Inflation will probably go up a bit more as we head into the last few months of 2021 for those factors that I've mentioned, but a few other things, as I say, that tapering of the VAT cut. We saw the energy price cap in Great Britain was increased from the start of this month, and that will feed into the overall UK inflation figures. And that expectation that global goods prices will continue to see some upward pressure. So inflation will probably go a bit higher, but we do ultimately expect it to be temporary as global economic activity gets back to more normalized levels. As the market adjusts to the excess demand in certain areas, we think that will start to taper off. How long it will take is much harder to say. But the expectation is that it will be temporary, and hopefully as we move through 2022, we'll start to see some more normalization starting to return there. We do expect that there will be some caution from consumers and businesses as we go forward. So don't make no mistake, the easing restrictions did give a bit of a boost. We saw our Danske Bank Consumer Confidence Index rise strongly in the second quarter of the year. Some local business surveys also said in Q2 business confidence was a bit higher. But there's probably a few reasons that we'll see a bit of caution. So for consumers, the fact that the pandemic is still there, coronavirus case numbers have been relatively high for quite a few weeks now, running in excess of an average of over 1,000 a day. So that may still impact some people on how willing they are to go out into crowded spaces and town centres and restaurants and shops. Brexit uncertainty also is persisting, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But one of the things that our consumer confidence index has shown is that Brexit uncertainty has been adversely impacting consumers as well. And given some of those inflationary pressures that I've mentioned, if that effectively weakens consumer spending power, that could again lead people to just be a bit more cautious in their spending as well. While on the business side, those same factors may lead some firms to perhaps prioritise rebuilding cash reserves or paying down debt, as opposed to investing in future growth plans or strategic investment projects. So probably still a little bit of caution out there. And the extra trade frictions that are being worked through as a result of the post-Brexit trading arrangements and the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Again, I'll touch a little bit on recent developments on that towards the end, but I think some of the business surveys have shown that firms are adapting to the new arrangements. They are still a challenge, but as time progresses and businesses become more familiar with some of the processes that they're now having to complete, they're adapting to it. But it does still add a cost and an additional burden on businesses, which has its impacts on the pace of economic activity. So if we take those 5 factors and think about what that means in terms of the rate of growth, we published our Q3 sector forecast report at the end of September. And we now expect that the Northern Ireland economy will grow by around 5.8% in 2021. Now that's a little bit lower than we had thought at the earlier part of the summer. Our previous forecast had been 6.2%. And the reason for that downward move, some of the things that we've talked about there, it's that supply chain disruption impacting the pace of recovery, some of that continued caution, and also just the outworkings of the latest economic data flowing through into the forecast. But while it is a downward revision, I would still say that 5.8% would be a relatively strong rate of economic expansion this year and would represent good progress on the journey to economic recovery. For 2022, we expect to see growth of about 4.7%. That's a little bit higher than the 4.5% we had projected above or previously, and that's really just as the growth rate for 2021 is likely to come down a little, some more of the recovery is pushed into 2022. For the UK economy, we expect to see growth of around 6.5% and 5.4%, so a bit stronger than Northern Ireland, and that's in line with what we would normally have seen historically. The wider UK economy would grow a bit quicker than here, but again, reasonably strong rates of expansion. With regards to employee jobs growth, the latest labour market data in Northern Ireland has been relatively positive, and I'm sure that many of you will have experienced some of the labour supply shortages that are currently very prevalent. So the data is showing us that there is some demand there for labour. The quarterly employment survey showed an increase in the number of jobs in Q2. But we do think that the end of the furlough scheme will lead to some job losses. Hopefully not anywhere near as much as we would have feared, 18 months or so ago, whenever the pandemic first took hold and there was a wide fear that unemployment could run very high. The furlough scheme really has been successful at keeping employees linked to their employers, and so hopefully any job losses that we do see will be much lower in number than we would have previously expected. And we do then expect to see the number of jobs return to growth on average in 2022 of around 1%. From an unemployment perspective, the numbers I have here are averages over the year. So I recognise it sometimes looks a little bit strange to see unemployment going up in 2022 when jobs growth is also rising. And part of this is just the averaging out over the year. So unemployment remained quite low in Northern Ireland in the early parts of 2021, given the likes of the furlough scheme. So when we're averaging it out, those low rates in 2021 pull that number down a little bit. But again, forecasts of around 4.1%, 4.4%, probably much lower than we would have previously thought. On inflation, we expected the average this year around 2.2%, and again averaging about 2.7 and 22, so higher, both above the Bank of England's 2% target for some of the reasons that we talked about. And consumer spending growth we expect to see rising as well over this year and next. So if we look at that at a sector level, and I'll not speak to every sector, but I will point to a few here. We've disaggregated those forecasts for the overall economy into the main 19 sectors. And so if I just highlight a few of them, the sectors that we expect to grow the strongest this year and next year are the consumer-focused industries, so the likes of hospitality and restaurants, arts, entertainment, and leisure businesses. Though it's important to note that those were the sectors most impacted by the pandemic during 2020. So the fact that they're growing off a much lower base than some other industries does lead to stronger percentage rates of growth, and that's what we're seeing there. But the easing of restrictions and the spending that we have seen, consumers seem to have reacted relatively well to the easing of restrictions and doing some spending over the summer, should see those two sectors experience relatively strong growth this year and next. From a construction and manufacturing perspective, they sit around the middle of our growth league table. We expect to see construction growth of around 6.7% this year, manufacturing about 5.6%. Again, those are both a little bit lower than we had projected earlier in the summer, and given the likes of those supply chain disruptions, the labour shortages that we're seeing, and those are having an impact on those sectors. Wholesale and retail trade, we think, will grow about 6.8% this year, so stronger than the average for the overall economy. It's not as much as the other consumer-focused industries, but the drop in 2020 in retail wasn't quite as stark again as those other parts of the economy, for a variety of reasons. One is that essential retail remained open during much of the pandemic, and that represents part of that sector. Another is the adjustment that businesses made, perhaps to selling online, which meant they were able to continue some levels of activity. But still reasonably strong growth for retail trade this year. And for sectors like professional services and ICT, we see growth of just over 6% this year, just over 5% next year. And traditionally, these sectors would have been among the strongest performing in Northern Ireland prior to the pandemic. So those above average growth rates, again, showing relatively strong performances for those sectors. From a jobs perspective, then again, we've split out the forecast by sectors, and the parts of the economy where we expect to see the biggest average job losses is those consumer-focused parts of the economy. But I would highlight that some of those, that -4% and -5.1% there, are in large part driven by job losses in those sectors in the first quarter of the year. So again, there's an average annual aspect coming into this. But given the demand for workers in those sectors, hopefully as we go through this year, we'll see the recovery in jobs really picking up there. And you can see in 2022, reasonably strong forecasts for both of those industries, 3.4%, 4.1%. About half of the sectors we actually expect to see average job increases in 2021, and it's those ICT and professional services sectors that I mentioned as being traditionally strong employers that we expect to lead the way this year with growth of around 1.9%. And if we look to 2022, we think that there will hopefully be increases in the average number of jobs across all sectors of the economy. But of course, we have to recognise that there are still risks and uncertainties out there which could impact the performance of the Northern Ireland economy. So the coronavirus pandemic, I think, remains the most significant risk to the economic outlook. So, of course, we've had the successful rollout of the vaccine programme, and those higher coronavirus case numbers that we've had for a while now, the rollout of the vaccine programme is a big part of why we're hopeful that we won't have to go back into full periods of lockdown. But as we all unfortunately know, the pandemic is very difficult to predict. So the possibility of a new variant of the virus or of pressure coming through under the NHS. They have to treat patients who become ill, could potentially lead to further periods of restrictions. And if we were to see that, there would be knock-on impacts on the pace of the economic recovery. So the pandemic, I think, still very much the biggest risk to the economic outlook. Another is that the supply chain disruptions that we've talked about become more persistent and continue for longer. So as I said, we do expect that to be temporary, those disruptions and the inflation tied with them to be temporary. And that's a view shared by most other economic commentators and forecasters. But it's very difficult to know just how long those will last. And it probably will take us into at least the early part of 2022, if not longer. But if they were to be even more persistent, if they were to last longer, if they weren't to ease as we go through next year, then again, that's going to constrain business activity. It's going to put upward pressure on prices, and that would squeeze consumer spending and create more uncertainty around what the appropriate interest rate policy to manage that might be. So those supply chain disruptions, very much a key area to focus on as we go forward, and what the different trends are showing us around how that is developing. And we have uncertainty surrounding the post-Brexit trading arrangements. So political uncertainty around the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol is continuing. The UK in the summer published its proposals for what it wants to see changed and what it wants to address within the protocol. There's expectations that we'll see some proposals from the EU in the not too distant future as well. And then in all likelihood, a period of negotiation between the UK and EU teams again as to what can be done to ease the impacts of the protocol in terms of businesses and bringing goods from Great Britain and what that actually looks like. It's very hard to know what the outworking of those negotiations and those talks might be, but I think businesses do want clarity, and while that uncertainty continues to surround, it is a potential risk to the economic outlook, as the businesses don't have the certainty and the clarity they need to make their plans and begin further steps in that adaptation that they've been taking so far. So Brexit uncertainty still remaining a potential risk. But overall, I think in summary, it's still a relatively positive economic outlook. If we were to see the rates of growth that I've talked about today, that would represent good progress towards economic recovery. Yes, there are challenges there. We've seen the supply chain disruption. We're seeing the impact of that on inflation, the labour shortages as well. And the result of those challenges emerging probably means it's not quite as positive an outlook as it was earlier in the summer, but it is still relatively positive. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that the economy is recovering from the impact of the pandemic more quickly than we probably thought it would at the end of last year and start of this year. And hopefully we'll see that recovery continue over the last part of this year and into 2022. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop there, and I'll happily take any questions or comments.
We have a few questions on the chat box, Conor.
Yeah, do you want me, Anna, to go through them? I can see them here.
You can see them okay? Yeah, great.
I can indeed, yeah. So Conor, what are your thoughts on the implications for Northern Ireland on the current levels of gas prices in the UK and across Europe?
Yes, so I mean, what we're seeing there is we've seen bills for consumers in terms of gas prices increase quite sharply. We're seeing businesses face those higher gas prices as well. The implications of it are when we see those higher energy prices and the higher inflation tied with it on the consumer side, it does erode consumer spending power. So I suppose the last time we saw inflation having that impact on consumers was probably in the aftermath of the EU referendum, where it was driven more by sterling depreciation at the time, put upward pressure on prices. So when we see higher rates of inflation that erodes consumer spending power, it takes away from the impacts of consumers to boost overall economic growth. And given that the Northern Ireland economy, and indeed the UK economy, is very much a consumer-led economy, that does have the potential to weaken the pace of the economic recovery. On the business side as well, it adds more cost. So energy costs are something faced by almost all firms in some shape or form, particularly the likes of those in manufacturing and construction, which would be energy intensive industries. And so higher costs there does pose a challenge. So so it is very much one to watch as we go forward, because it has the potential to add challenges to both the consumer side of the economy, but the business side of the economy as well.
Okay. Another question: what actions do you think the government will take to pay for the cost of the pandemic? And at what period do you think interest rates will start to rise?
So if we take the government piece first, I think there's a few things to consider here. So the first is we shouldn't lose sight of the importance actually of the overall economic recovery in this as well. Typically, whenever public finances are evaluated, both in terms of the annual deficit, but also total levels of public debt, they're often measured as a proportion of GDP. And I think we had seen during the pandemic, UK debt did exceed 100% of GDP for the first time in a long time. But as GDP expands, as the economy gets bigger, that effectively does change the denominator of that particular fraction. So one thing I think that the government will be hopeful for is that we see this strong economic recovery and that GDP becomes bigger, which reduces that sort of debt to GDP ratio. The second thing then to consider is potential changes in fiscal policy. So I think it's unlikely that we would see another period of austerity like we saw in the years after the financial crisis. So we very much saw reductions in government spending in those pre-crisis years, or those post-crisis years, sorry. Given the government's commitments to levelling up, given like we have the COP26 conference coming up later this year, and I think that recognition of the need for investment in addressing some of the climate challenges, I think there will still be an appetite for government spending, and it may be more targeted in areas like those, but I don't think we will see the big broad brush cuts to government spending that we saw before, although a more targeted approach may mean there's parts of public spending are a bit more constrained, which then leads us to the tax question. So we have the increase in corporation tax, which is coming down the tracks and was announced as part of the budget earlier this year. We've seen the increase in the national insurance contributions aimed at addressing challenges in health and social care. Is there the potential for further tax increases? Yes, there probably is. Will it happen straight away? I would be a bit surprised if it did. I think the government will, in the first instance, probably want to give as much support as it can to overall economic activity levels increasing. But if that does not do enough to try and get the public finances back on what the government deemed to be a sustainable footing, then we may see further tax increases. And it's also possible that at the next budget, the Chancellor may set out some fiscal rules or give us a bit more clarity around what they see as sustainable levels and how they plan to get there. So I don't think there'd be big spending cuts like we saw after the crisis, potential for further tax increases if they're needed. But I think given what we've already heard on national insurance and corporation tax, I think the government would prefer not to increase taxes if they can, but I think the potential of it looking forward is still there.
Mm-hmm. I do think businesses need a respite. I don't think they need further increases at this point in time. So hopefully that will be delayed for some time. What about interest rates? How do you think they will sit?
Yes, so given the inflation that we're now seeing starting to come through, the market implied interest rate curve has moved forward quite a bit and actually sees the potential even for a few interest rate rises next year. I don't think we'll see an increase in 2021, and there's been a little bit of talk actually even about the potential for a rise in December of this year. I don't think we'll see that. I think rates will stay at their 0.1% through the rest of this year. I think what the Bank of England will be watching very closely is probably three main things. One is just how persistent the higher inflation that we expect to see actually turns out to be. So, in some of the Bank of England forecasts, they expect it to go to 4%, a little bit above that even, through the end of this year, and to remain in and around that 4% number at the start of 2022. If it rises even higher, if it becomes more persistent, if it doesn't start to come down, that's one thing the Bank of England will be watching very closely. But they'll also be looking at inflation expectations, because the Bank of England's monetary policy target is to achieve inflation of around 2% over the medium term. So it's, if you have inflation at 4% in January, putting interest rates up in January doesn't mean inflation drops back in February. It takes time to work its way through the economy. And that's why expectations for inflation is quite important as well. So what the financial markets expect inflation to be over the medium term? What are business expectations of inflation? What are consumer expectations of inflation? And if those start to become significantly disjointed from that 2% target rate, then that could prompt the Bank of England to take action. And another important point will be dynamics that we see in terms of wage increases. It's quite hard to really understand what's happening with wages in the economy at the minute, because the wage data is being impacted by some of the post-pandemic policies. So if you were on furlough, you were still employed, but you were effectively on 20% lower in terms of wage of what you were actually earning. If you're now back working, then the pay you're getting is therefore higher. And some of those outworkings are having an impact on what the headline wage growth numbers in the economy are from a statistics perspective. I think the expectation is that they're probably stripping those factors out a bit higher than we would have seen prior to the pandemic, given some of the labour supply shortages there. But the reason this matters is that the inflation at the minute is being viewed as temporary, driven by impacts of the pandemic, driven by those fuel prices, the base cost, some of the things we talked about. If this inflation becomes more what we might consider traditional inflation, so the likes of a wage price spiral, where the higher prices that we're seeing now for this external factor lead into higher demand for wages, which in turn increases demand in the economy and leads to higher demand for goods and services, pushing prices up, which again puts upward pressure on wages, and we get into that spiral. That again is where you might need a monetary policy response to try and address that more traditional inflation. So I think those are the things that the Bank of England will be looking at. I think the potential for a rise next year is probably quite likely. Certainly it's what financial markets would be telling us for those inflation reasons. And also the Bank of England will probably want to get back to slightly higher interest rates. If we were to see another economic challenge in the future, if interest rates are 0.1%, you don't really have much lower you can go. So when we talked about interest rates prior to the pandemic, at some of the events that we were doing face to face, we were quite often thinking about them in the context of getting back to more normal monetary policy. The inflation we're seeing now has probably changed the debate a bit. It's more about how does the Bank of England respond to the higher inflation? But that normalization bit is probably still a factor there. So we could see a rise in 2022. How early we see it, I think, will depend on some of those factors that I've just spoken about.
That's brilliant, Conor, very comprehensive. One of our other questions is, do you think we have the supply of graduates to fill the demand coming from the financial services, as there appears to be significant vacancies there at the minute?
I think we're probably seeing skill shortages across large parts of the economy. So financial services is part of it. I think we're seeing it across other bits of the economy as well. And again, actually, prior to the pandemic, one of the challenges I was hearing most from businesses was skill shortages across all sectors, was getting the right people for the right jobs. And it probably, but understandably, faded off the agenda during the pandemic, because that's where everyone's focus was. It's quite right, the government focused on that. Businesses were focusing on getting through and continuing trading and keeping activity levels going. As the economy has started to reopen again and businesses have tried to start increasing activity again, that's probably brought these challenges back to the fore for them. Now, there is a great deal of work underway. I think the Department of the Economy earlier in the year published a consultation on their skills strategy as part of their vision for a 10x economy. But addressing skills challenges takes time. It's not an easy thing to turn around. It does take time and effort. I think what we would hope to see going forward is really just collaboration in terms of skills. So between government, between businesses, and between the academic sector, so universities and colleges, in terms of what are the skills that the businesses actually need. Whether that involves placements within work as part of it. There's a number of firms now are bringing people straight in after school and putting them through university at the same time as working within the business. So they're building up their academic qualifications alongside what they're actually doing in work and the skills that you learn on the job. And hopefully we'll see more of that collaboration across the different parts of the economy on skills. But I suspect that skill shortages will remain a challenge for businesses in the short term, because there is demand for labour, and there's not the supply to currently match it. And as I say, it's recognised as a policy challenge, but it's not one that's easy to turn around overnight.
And the problem that we're seeing is that in some sectors, people having been able to be at home for I suppose longer periods of time, have seen that they don't want to go back to working late at night or working in certain industries. So there's certain sectors that people have just left, and that goes from the very lowest of jobs to the highest level of jobs, and they're being very hard to replace at the minute. So it is going to be a problem going forward. I think we probably only have one more question that we have time for, Conor, but outside of the Brexit and the pandemic, if we look forward, what do you think are the policy priorities that we need here to strengthen the Northern Ireland economy? And it's a big question, so.
It is a big question, so I'll maybe try and focus it on probably 3 areas. Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, as I say, so taking the pandemic and taking Brexit out of it, we're looking towards the medium term on what we need to see to strengthen the local economy. And I think the 3 areas that I would point to are productivity, economic inactivity, and exporting. So if I begin with productivity, productivity is effectively the amount of output produced by a worker in an hour. So it's how much somebody produces in an hour of work. And it is a key driver of economic growth, of wages, and of living standards. In Northern Ireland, over the past 2 decades or so, average productivity levels have been just under 20% lower than the average for the overall UK economy. And in the post-financial crisis years, the UK's productivity performance has underperformed relative to other advanced economies. So we are a relatively poor performer compared to another relatively poor performer in terms of our productivity. So boosting productivity requires investment in skills, education, and infrastructure, and innovation, and R&D, firms competing globally and forcing them to be as productive and efficient as they can be. It's not an easy thing to change, and it does involve a broad-based policy approach. But given its importance in terms of driving economic performance and wages and living standards, I think boosting our productivity performance is one key priority. I think another is reducing rates of economic inactivity in Northern Ireland. So when we look at labour market statistics, we tend to focus on employment and unemployment rates. The third rate there is economic inactivity. So you're deemed to be unemployed if you don't have a job, but you're looking for one. You're deemed to be economically inactive if you don't have a job and you're not looking for one. Economic inactivity in Northern Ireland, latest data is about 25.8% here. That's higher than the roughly 21% for the overall UK. And again, over the last number of decades, economic inactivity here has been higher than in the wider UK economy. So I think bringing that down, and now there's all sorts of different reasons for inactivity. Sometimes it's people who are ill, sometimes it's people who are students, sometimes people who have taken early retirement, sometimes it's people who have other responsibilities at home, caring for family members. But if we can find a way to support some of the people who are economically inactive into work, that would again provide benefits in terms of economic output globally. And my third point then would come around to sort of exports. And I know from my engagement with businesses, we have some phenomenal local firms in Northern Ireland who do compete in global markets with the best of the best from different economies. And I would just like to see more of it. You know, if, as I say, with the productivity piece, if you're a business who is selling internationally, then, you know, your competition isn't just firms in other parts of Northern Ireland or the UK, but it's firms in Europe and America and Asia and Australasia. And that tends to force you to be better because you're competing with the best of the best in all different economies. As I say, we have a lot of great firms who do it really well, but I think we could do more with it. And so I would like to see further export activity and a focus on driving exports, again, as a policy priority for us as we look to grow the Northern Ireland economy in the years ahead.
Yeah, it is one of the strategy points going forward, and we are working very hard on that in the Northwest area as well. I'm not sure what time it's going to cut off at. We may actually be ended up very abruptly, but there is one more question, so I will ask it. Do you think that the ROI economy will outperform Northern Ireland's growth over the next couple of years?
Well, historically, it has tended to. Sometimes it can be difficult to fully interpret the ROI economy from a purely GDP perspective, given some of the large multinational firms that are present there, and so there's different ways of looking at different economic measures. But if we do just take those sort of headline macro levels, it typically has done in the years prior to the pandemic. As we move forward, some of the pandemic outputs might make the headline figures a little bit more difficult to interpret because, as I say, growth rates are a function of what happened during the pandemic and the pace at which you're bouncing back from. If we see what we did prior to the pandemic, then you would expect that it probably will. As I say, that's what we were seeing before. The extent to which it does so, it's sort of hard to know at the minute. Probably understand it a bit more actually if we're looking at growth rates from like 2023 and 24. Where you might have been through the pandemic and the bounce back, and you might then be considering more trend rates of growth, which is probably a better measure of different rates of economic expansion. So we might have a better picture of what the differences may be when we're through the pandemic impact.
Okay. A very mixed time, Conor. It's I don't know how you do the job with such changing events day by day, and I suppose the political stability here as well has to be a factor in it all going forward. But listen, thank you so much for a really interesting and informative event. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure the audience did too. So until the next one, Conor, thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Dawn, and thanks, everybody. Goodbye.